road analogy, broadband is the road, internet is one of the trucks that uses that road to deliver services and information. And so you have a broadband telecommunications infrastructure in your community. You can have internet, you can have telemedicine, you can have telephone, you can have TV, you can have many services traveling over that broadband infrastructure. And I really think that's the challenge in communities today, particularly rural communities, is to build modern digital road systems. In the early 20th century, we were making a transition from mostly dirt roads around the country to paved roads. And we needed those paved roads because we had a new types of transportation vehicles. I've always loved this quote from Henry Ford. And today, I really think what the telephone and the cable companies are trying to do is just make the buggies go faster. And what we really want is automobiles. Another way to think about broadband is a water pipe analogy. Today we have the equivalent of a very small water hose or water pipe to most of our homes and businesses. And we really just want something larger. We want more water. We want more internet delivered. We want different kinds of TV and video and streaming services delivered. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to get that done today. Several years ago, I was reading a book by Michael Borstein, the creators, and it turns out broadband is not one of the first technologies that communities have struggled with. The very first technology that communities wanted goes back a very long way, and this is an actual quote from 1400. Local merchants in Europe were going to the town leaders and saying, well, if we only had this new technology, everything would be so much better in the community. We'd be able to have more business and things would be going better. And what was going on in 1400 that required new technology? Europe was emerging from what we call the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, and commerce was beginning to increase between towns and communities. And it turned out that if you're going to have a business meeting with merchants in two different towns, they both needed to know what time it was. And so the town clock was the first technology in communities. And what was funny, really funny, I thought, was that the first clocks only rang the hour. They didn't have a clock face because most people couldn't read. And so they just had clock bells in a tower that rang the hour. And within 50 or 60 years, all the clocks needed upgrades. And what happened was around 1454, we had the emergence of the printing press, and people began to be able to read, so they wanted clocks with a clock face. And so the clocks that were only 50 years old, and everybody said, well, to be modern and up to date, we nearly need to upgrade our clocks. So we've had this conversation before many times. We've had it about water and sewer in the early to mid-1900s. A lot of rural communities had exactly the same struggle with electric service. And so here we are at the beginning of the 21st century. We're talking about a new basic infrastructure need for rural communities. We're talking about a digital road system. The right amount of broadband for your community is whatever your businesses need to compete in the global economy. Right now, the FCC, for example, has said, well, 10.3 or 25.4 or 25.5 is probably the right amount of broadband. That's going to change. It's going to continue to increase. And I think it's really important for communities, if they're going to spend money on this digital road system, that you make sure you put one in with the capacity that's going to support you well into the future. And the great news is, particularly if you invest in fiber future-proofs your community. We're not going to run out of capacity on fiber that we put in the ground or hang on poles. Even the FCC and the federal government have come around to the idea that communities really have to begin making these infrastructure decisions themselves. I know we get a lot of calls from communities that say, well, should we just wait until the federal government sends us some grant money? And given the deficit problems, even though there is some talk about infrastructure investments right now coming from the feds, I don't hear very much about money being allocated for broadband. There is some available, and I'm not saying you don't go after it, but the communities that are beginning to prosper are the ones that have already made a decision to spend some of their own money. So you certainly pursue grants where they're available and try to get those. But I think it's important for communities to really take control of this issue. The incumbents are not coming to rural communities. If they were, they'd already be in our rural communities and have installed upgraded infrastructure. It's interesting to me, Franklin Roosevelt back in 1932 said government has the right to to offer certain kinds of utilities if the private sector is not stepping up to the plate. And so I always thought there is a role for local government. It doesn't mean you have to go into the internet and TV business in a retail way and have people coming to this town hall or the county administration building to buy their internet. But there are some ways to make investments in infrastructure and not actually compete directly with the private sector. I've started using the word crisis more recently. Even though I've been doing this for a very long time, it's really only in the last year or so I've started to say rural communities, I think, are, if they're not already in crisis, they're very close to being in crisis. The larger incumbents are simply making it very clear that in most cases, and there are some private sector investments being made, but a lot of places are being bypassed. And some of the incumbents are very open about saying, we can't make a business case in these smaller communities and we're not going to upgrade the infrastructure. The problem is that as we go from community to community and try to sort out some of these issues, we're hearing, for example, from real estate agents who tell us that people won't live in parts of the community or in rural parts of a county where there isn't good broadband. And young people in particular, if you're trying to attract young people to your community or keep them in the community after they graduate from high school or college, they're voting with their feet and saying, we want to live in places where there's really good broadband. There are some success stories. Bozeman, Montana recently built 23 miles of fiber. It was financed by local banks, and they have 5 private sector providers on the network in the first 6 months. So they're bringing true competition and choice in a relatively small city in the West. The Wired Road is one of the earliest fiber and wireless networks in a part of Southwest Virginia that looks very much like lots of parts of Arkansas. It's more than 1,000 square miles of mountainous terrain, and they've taken a sort of slow and steady approach, and over a period of almost a decade have been able to raise nearly $4 million in funding, have fiber in their business parks and in their downtown areas, and lots of rural wireless. Charles City County, Virginia, one of the smallest counties in Virginia, just total county population is 7,200, was able to put together a very high performance fiber network for their business park and to extend wireless broadband into other parts of the county. Powell, Wyoming, another very small rural community, is a 6-year-old fiber project that's been very, very successful. They paid off some of their debt early, and they have 2 providers offering services competitively, so they have true competition and true choice. Danville, Virginia is another really interesting project where we helped. They had 20% unemployment in the early 2000s. They really looked at fiber in 2007 as a part of a broader restructuring of economic development that included rehabbing abandoned or rundown buildings in the downtown area, creating Class A office space, making investments not only in broadband infrastructure, but in streets, roads, and building infrastructure. And 10 years later, they've radically transformed the local economy. They have national companies now coming to put workers in white-collar and high-tech workers in what was an old mill town that was based largely on wood products and tobacco. So broadband helps you attract new businesses. It's very important in helping you retain existing businesses. It creates new job opportunities. We do a lot of surveys in rural areas. One of the things we're seeing very consistently is that there's many more people in rural areas that are trying to work from home or run a business from home. And it's one of the most common complaints we get about broadband in rural communities is, I can't work from home. There's kind of 2 things going on with work from home and business from home. There are good paying jobs from home. Not everybody's going to be an entrepreneur and start a business in their home, but there's remote worker opportunities that are growing. In the 90s and early 2000s, a lot of call center jobs moved offshore. And over the last 5 or 6 years, a lot of those jobs have been coming onshore. And we're seeing, and a lot of those onshore sort of entry-level jobs are being filled by people that are working out of their home for a company remotely. And the key is that they have to have good broadband in their home to be able to have those jobs. 10 years ago, internet was not so important for smaller Main Street retail businesses. Now a very common complaint we hear when we talk to local businesses is that they need faster internet because it slows down credit card processing. I didn't really understand the full impact of this until some time ago. I talked to a delicatessen owner. The business is basically putting ham and mustard on bread and selling that. And you don't think of it as a high-tech business, but he said, if I had faster broadband, I could sell more sandwiches. He said what happens is when the line from the cash register gets to the door, people stop coming in. And he said, I really need to speed up my credit card processing so that I can take more orders at lunchtime. So we see even very traditional retail businesses that we wouldn't think of as high-tech are now being impacted by the lack of affordable high-performance broadband. As I mentioned, prior to about 2 years ago, we never heard from real estate agents in our studies and planning work in rural communities. Now the real estate agents are showing up all the time saying, we have a real problem because there's lots of homes we can't sell, or these homes are being sold at much lower prices than we expected because they have little or no good broadband. So broadband is changing land use, and it's beginning to change where people decide to live and work. And this is where I see this crisis in rural communities is I think some communities are going to be depopulated before they're able to solve the broadband problem. The goals are pretty simple. You want whatever amount of bandwidth is needed to support businesses, and this is easily achievable. We want everybody to have it. It ought to be available just like electricity is available. It ought to be affordable. In rural areas, wireless is going to be very important, and all telecom is a public-private partnership. At the very lowest level, the incumbents like to say, well, telecom should be left to the private sector, as if the government has no role. Well, all of the telephone and cable companies are using public right-of-way. So even looking at the incumbent situation today, it's already a public-private partnership, and government certainly has a role to play at some level. What is broadband not? Well, it's not expensive. You can start small and build on success. Projects like the Wired Road have been able to build over a 10-year period a major regional network. They started with just $200,000. And they didn't try to eat the elephant all in one bite. They recognized they're going to have to bite off small pieces, and that's what they've done. They've been very successful. It doesn't have to be difficult. It's very important to start with a good business plan and get a technical design that's really appropriate for the community. This is straightforward, and business and financial planning is really more important than the technical aspects. People get very worried about the technical aspects. It's very easy to get the right kind of advice for the technical design of the network. We really try to start with the financing and the business aspects, and then and only then do we put together the technical design. It's not complicated. I like to remind people fiber networks are mostly cheap plastic pipe. Communities routinely put in very complex water and sewer systems, and installing fiber is much less expensive and much less difficult than putting in a water or sewer extension. And wireless networks are mostly simple towers. So this stuff is not complicated. The incumbents have done a very good job of convincing us that this is too difficult for smaller communities, and nothing is farther from the truth. It's not even particularly hard to manage. You can hire good qualified firms to help you maintain and manage and repair that infrastructure. You only have to answer 3 questions. Who's going to own it? It could be a community nonprofit. It could be direct town or county ownership. It could be a co-op. We've always thought co-ops are a very good model, and telephone and electric co-ops have been very important in rural areas. Communities make investments in infrastructure like conduit or fiber and lease that out to the private sector as a partnership. and actually create a revenue stream. I mentioned the city of Danville. They paid off their initial loan for their network years ago, and they have money now. The network generates enough funds to make modest expansions every year, and they actually make a contribution to the city general fund every year. So these things can get into the black and can provide additional revenue streams for local government. Local financing is possible. I mentioned in Bozeman, a good business plan got 8 local banks to agree to finance the network. So can do it with local funding. There's ways to do it that you're not going to compete directly with the private sector.